All right, I want to begin with a couple questions about the fractal presentation real quick, but ones that I just jotted down. And then I promise we will try and get to as many of these other ones as we possibly can. The layer upon layer, does that mean that the formula changed? So if you were to take one of those numbers as you zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, grab that number, has the formula changed, or does the formula just create? So if you were to represent that number in the formula, would the formula be exactly what it was at the beginning when you started that, or would it be a multiplication of those numbers? So it would be, what was the formula? Give me the first part of the formula. Zn?
Z squared plus C.
Z squared plus C. So would it be like Z squared plus C to the 9th power if you zoom right in? Is that formula multiplying as well?
No, the formula stays the same.
Okay.
What you're doing when you zoom in is you're looking at a narrower range of numbers that you're running through that formula.
Okay, so in the original, you have to graph the x-axis and the y-axis. In math, we're taught there's a z-axis, right? 3 dimensions. You're not zooming down the z-axis. You're actually just zooming in on an x-y axis.
Yeah.
Okay,
there's no z-axis. The mathematical fractals, there's no z-axis. They're two-dimensional.
So then you're dealing with a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a number when you are zooming way in.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Is it possible, because you showed how you have a mathematical formula that creates like a lightning looking at spiral galaxy, broccoli, ferns. Is it possible that every created item that God himself has created is represented in a mathematical fractal with some conceptual parallel?
It could be. Nobody knows because they're infinite, and we haven't explored, and we'll never explore them infinitely because they're infinite.
Because we got bow ties.
We got bow ties. We got seahorses. We got elephants. Yeah.
Ferns. Broccoli.
You got ferns. If you allow different sets, that's probably the case. But nobody really knows. I mean, this is the beginning of the adventure, and human beings have not explored fractals for real. We've only known about these since 1980. So, I mean, we're just at the beginning of the game on these things. So, yeah, but they are infinite, so there could be anything in there.
When you're looking at the original one with the cardioid.
Cardioid.
Cardioid. When you zoomed in on that, where the Valley of the Elephants was at the tip of that, it looked as if that valley never meets. It goes on and on and on. Is that true, or does it reach a point at some point where it stops?
Well, they connect at 1/4, but in terms of the elephants get smaller and smaller. And so there are, in fact, an infinite number of elephants in Elephant Valley. You could continue to zoom in on that cusp forever, infinitely. There's an infinite number of elephants.
Wow.
Until you go to the Z cubed, and there's twice that many, right?
What are your current thoughts on the God force or the God particle that keeps atoms together?
Yeah, so it's poorly named, and I don't think that they meant any disrespect in calling it the God particle. They're referring to the Higgs boson. It's something that was predicted to exist on the basis of our standard model of particle physics, and the idea is that the Higgs field, for every particle there's a field that's associated with it. The Higgs field, a field is something that penetrates all through space, like a magnetic field. You might have seen a magnet with iron filings around it, and how they show you the magnetic field. Even though the field itself is invisible, you can make it visible with iron filings. The idea is that there's a Higgs field that permeates the entire universe that gives particles their mass based on how much they interact with the Higgs field. And so particles like light, which don't have any mass, they don't interact with the Higgs field. They just go straight through it. Whereas particles that are heavier, like protons and neutrons, electrons, they interact with that Higgs field, and that gives them mass. And then the Higgs boson is sort of the smallest particle that's associated with that field, and it's complicated, but I think the physics there is good. I think that the Higgs field is right. It's good physics. It is the way that God has chosen to impart mass to the particles that He created. So it's not a replacement for God. It's the mechanism that God uses. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Would you explain how we perceive being outside the Milky Way galaxy, looking at it with the naked eye from our backyard, when the spot from which we are standing, observing it, is in the Milky Way galaxy?
Yeah. So if you think about it, the Milky Way, it's disc shaped. It's a spiral, but it's got some thickness to it. It's not like paper. It's got some thickness to it. So what happens when you take a look at a disc that has some thickness, edge on, like a plate edge on? What does it look like? It looks like a straight line, doesn't it? And that's why when you go out on a summer night when it's nice and clear, you'll see this straight line, a cloudy band. That's the Milky Way. It's spiral. It's a disk. We're in the disk, and so it looks like a straight line that covers the sky that way.
But you see pictures of the Milky Way galaxy. Are those artists' conceptions? Because we
Yes.
can't actually go out and take a picture of our galaxy.
Right. We can't get outside our galaxy. So if you've seen an image of the Milky Way from above, it's an artist's conception. It's not real. Or they'll show another galaxy that's spiral, and they'll say, our galaxy looks like this one, which we think it does.
Is the sun diminishing? And if the Earth is 1 million years old, would the sun be touching the Earth going back 1 million years?
The answer is no. The sun's not. It's not shrinking. There was an old argument that some creationists had jumped on that said the sun is shrinking. But no, I used the SOHO spacecraft in my doctoral dissertation, and it's able to measure the sun very, very precisely. The sun is not. It's not shrinking in size, not substantially.
How is it burning up without shrinking or consuming fuel?
Well, it does consume fuel, but the nuclear fusion that's going on in the core, it's converting hydrogen into helium. So the number of atoms, well, the number of protons and neutrons remains the same. It's just the protons get converted to neutrons, and that releases energy. So it's not really losing mass, not substantially.
So it won't lose mass. Will it burn out?
Eventually, it will. Once you run out of hydrogen, once all the hydrogen is converted to helium, then there's no more power available. But the interesting thing is there's enough mass there that it could continue to it's a very efficient power source. It could continue to fuse hydrogen into helium for potentially 5 to 10 billion years in a hypothetical future. So it's not something you're going to have to worry about in your lifetime. And even if it were, I'm sure the Lord has other plans.
Unless I can travel at the speed of light for a long time.
That's true.
And come back.
But then I think you'd meet the return of the Lord a lot quicker that way. I think that's what would happen.
Who came up with the idea of an Oort cloud originally, and how long has it been an idea or a proposition?
The Oort cloud, it was invented. It's named after its inventor, Jan Oort, and I forget when he came up with the idea, but it's been around for a while. It's been around for probably almost a century, maybe not quite a century, and so he came up with that idea that you have a comet generator, that this big sphere of potential comets, as a solution to the fact that comets appear to support a young solar system, and we can't have that.
What is the evolutionist rationale for planetary magnetic fields?
Okay, so we talked about how magnetic fields decay with time. We can measure that. The secularists, their rescuing device for that is to say that there must be some kind of recharging mechanism that rebuilds the magnetic fields after they decay. And they call it a magnetic dynamo. And it's supposed to work a bit like the alternator in your car. The alternator in your car takes the mechanical energy from the wheels and uses that to recharge the battery. So the idea is that you can take mechanical energy from a planet's rotation and somehow put that into the magnetic field. And there are many problems with that, not the least of which is the alternator in your car is a pretty complicated, it's a complex instrument. It takes some design to be able to take mechanical energy and transform it into electrical energy. Whereas you don't have that complex mechanism in something like the Earth. Also, the dynamo requires differential rotation. It would require the Earth's equator to be spinning faster than the poles, which doesn't work so well for a solid planet like the Earth, right? It rotates as a solid body. And there are other problems with the dynamo model, too. For one thing, it requires the rotation axis to be aligned with the magnetic axis, which for the Earth, they're not too far off. They're like 11 degrees apart. But for Uranus, they're way off. It's like 96 degrees tilted or something. And likewise for Neptune, they're way off. So it has made predictions that have been falsified, whereas Dr. Humphrey's model has made predictions that have been verified.
What is the biggest star we know of, and how much bigger is it than our sun?
I'm not sure what the latest number is. I showed Antares in the presentation. Antares is about 600 times the size of the sun. So is Betelgeuse. They're both they're enormous stars. The biggest one would be maybe twice as big as Betelgeuse, and we think that stars probably can't get too much bigger than that anyway. There's a certain limit on the mass and size of stars for physical reasons.
What limits them?
There's what's called the Eddington limit for one, which it turns out that if you make a star bigger than a certain amount, it increases the pressure in the core to the point that the star would explode before you could actually get it together even. So that's called the Eddington limit. And that limits that's a mass limit, though. That limits the mass to something like 200 suns, I think. So that would be one limitation.
Is it true that all the stars start as giant ones, but over time become red dwarfs and eventually explode?
No, it's not true. Even in the secular view, they don't believe that. They used to teach that stars started as blue stars and then faded to red. Nobody believes that anymore either, by the way. The latest view is that stars start as main sequence stars. We talked about main sequence stars. They obey the rule. If you know the mass, you know everything else about it. and then they evolve into giant stars. And depending on the mass, some of them evolve into supergiants. Stars like the Sun that are relatively low mass are supposedly, then they eventually, when they run out of fuel and they collapse in on themselves and become a white dwarf. Stars that are much more massive than the Sun are thought to explode when they run out of fuel. It's kind of counterintuitive. You run out of fuel, so you explode. Oh, okay. We do know stars explode, but I'm not sure that's the right explanation for why. And in terms of stellar evolution, I'm not convinced that much of that. I'm not convinced there's much merit to it. It's not something you can observe, right? We don't observe stars changing over time, except a little bit. Sometimes their color will change a little bit, or their brightness will change a little bit from century to century. But in terms of seeing a star swell up into a giant, we've never seen that. It's never happened. I think giant stars are probably created giant stars.
When secular scientists talk about the Kuiper Belt, what are they referring to? Do creationists have another meaning for
Okay. Oh, yeah. So there's actually, I simplified it a little bit for the presentation, but there's two types of comets. There are short period comets, which have a period of less than 200 years. And there are long period comets, which have a period longer than 200 years or equal to 200 years. And it turns out short period comets tend to orbit in the plane of the solar system. They tend to orbit in the same disk as the planets, roughly. They can be off a little bit. And they tend to orbit in the same direction as the planets, with some exceptions. Halley's Comet's an exception. It orbits backwards relative to the planets. But long period comets are like cats. They just do what they want. They have tails, and they do what they want. And so a long period comet, if the planets are in this plane, a long period comet might be like this. It might come in like that and then zip out. Okay? And so and a different one will come in like that, and a different one will come in like that. So what they've done is and both of these, both short period comets and long period comets, are a problem for billions of years. But since they're two different categories of comets, they've had to propose two different sources for them. And so the Oort cloud is supposed to resupply the long period comets, and then the Kuiper belt is supposed to resupply the short period comets. But it gets a little more complex, though, because what happened was they were expecting to find trillions of comet-sized objects out beyond Neptune in a disk, okay? And they ought to look like comets. Instead, what they found were several hundred objects that are much larger than comets. Comets usually 4 or 5 miles across. Okay, in terms of the nucleus. They started finding objects that are 50 to 100, 500, 1,000 miles across, something like that. Much, much bigger than comets, orbiting out at that distance. And not quite, kind of in the disk, but with quite a bit more range than they were expecting. And they found that these objects typically were not the same color as comets. They tended to be redder than comets, which suggests their composition is different. And what they did was they said, well, see, we found the Kuiper belt. That wasn't remotely what you were expecting. You were expecting to find trillions of tiny comets, and instead you found hundreds of much larger objects that aren't even the same color as comets. And so they said they now call that the Kuiper belt. Okay, you can name it whatever you want, but it's not the kind of Kuiper belt they were expecting, and it's not the kind of Kuiper belt that will resupply short period comets. So there's still a problem.
Is there evidence for one original continent moving into the ones that we have now?
Yeah, there is. I do accept the idea of Pangea, the idea that the continents were originally connected. By the way, that's a creationist concept. Yeah, it was a creationist that came up with the idea that the continents were separated during the worldwide flood. And it was the secularists that hated that because you can't move something as big as a continent. And then after a while, they finally warmed up to the idea, and they said, well, maybe we can accept that as long as we slow it down and let it take millions and millions of years. But we do think that the continents were connected before Noah's flood. The fact that they fit together is pretty good evidence. And the fact that fossils, you can line up the fossils in certain regions. You'll find that fossils of creatures that lived before the flood that are on, say, the east coast of the United States match up with those in I guess would be Europe. But in any case, you can match up the way the fossils are. Certain mountain chains that are pre-flood mountain chains, and that would be like maybe the Appalachians would be late flood or possibly pre-flood. Some of those line up as well. So there's good evidence that the continents were connected before the flood, and that would make sense too. Some people have said the scriptures may suggest that. The Bible says that originally God caused the waters to gather together into one place, which might suggest the land was in the other place. I don't know that that's conclusive, but it would make it easy for the animals to get to the ark too, because they wouldn't have to cross an ocean. And getting back's a little trickier, but not too much, because the ocean levels would have been lower after the flood. There had land bridges and ice bridges and such.
Why are secular scientists using a multiverse to support their origin of the universe?
Yeah, the multiverse. I think it's a version of the gambler's fallacy, which is the idea that if you flipped a coin, 10 times in a row, what are the odds that they'd all come up heads up? I mean, it'd be astronomical, right? And so somebody says, "Well, boy, we got this universe that's extremely fine-tuned. It's kind of like we landed heads up 10 times in a row. Therefore, it must just be that there's actually an incredible number of universes, and we just happened to get the one that got lucky." And so that's a form of the gambler's fallacy. It'd be like saying, I had this incredibly improbable event happen. Therefore, there must be lots of other rooms with other people gambling where they lost. It doesn't make sense to me. But it has to do with the fact that the universe appears to be well designed for life. Everybody knows that. Secularists know that. The universe is fine-tuned. It's designed for life. And that just doesn't make sense if the universe is chance. And so the idea is, well, there must be an infinite number of universes, and we just happened to land in the one that got lucky. That's really what it comes down to.
How do they recalculate the age of the universe? Is there any concern from scientists or secularists that their numbers continue to change so many times with such a vast difference?
Yeah, that's a concern. The way that they calculate the age of the universe, they don't calculate it, they estimate it. They make a guess at the age of the universe by measuring the rate of expansion, which we call the Hubble constant, the rate at which the universe is expanding, assuming that the conditions were basically like that in the past, and then rolling it back to a point where everything would be in a point. And so I think that's an unreasonable extrapolation, because it assumes that the universe was not created with size. I know it was created with size. Genesis tells us that. So that's what they're assuming. They're taking the Hubble constant and running it backwards, including for effects of gravity and things like that. It's a little bit complicated, but that's the basic idea. They run that back in time. And what happens is every now and then they re-estimate the Hubble constant, because they'll measure it's very hard to measure the expansion rate of the universe, because you need to measure the redshifts of galaxies. That's easy. And then you need to find the distance to those galaxies. That's hard. It's hard to get the distance to galaxies precisely. There's a few different methods that they use. And recently they just redid that. They re-estimated the Hubble constant, and it made the universe younger by 1 billion years or so than the previous estimate. And that is an issue. That is an issue because, last year, you're just a moron if you didn't believe the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Now you're a moron if you do believe that, because now we know it's only 12 to 13 billion years old, and so on. And so it does change from time to time. And then occasionally they'll run into inconsistency. There's actually an inconsistency now, because one estimate that they used to give the 13.8 billion years, that's still a good estimate in their view, and yet they've got another one that contradicts it. So it's really perplexing. I think it's a problem.
Are atheist presuppositions accepted as brute facts? And is there a rational argument for brute facts?
Yeah, I think most atheists are totally oblivious to their own presuppositions. And if you do pin them down and finally get them to think through them, they will accept them as brute facts. But then, of course, I'm going to point out that no, you can't have brute facts. Every facts are interpreted. They are interpreted. Anything that you believe, you need to. If you're going to be a rational person, you need to be able to give a reason for it, right? That's what rationality is. It's having good reasons for what you believe and abandoning beliefs for which you do not have good reasons. That's the whole point of education, by the way, is to come up with good biblical reasons for what you believe. Children are not rational. Children don't have good reasons for what they believe. They believe there's a monster in the closet. They have no logical reason to believe there's a monster in the closet. But they nonetheless act on that belief. They pull the sheets over their head, and they think that protects them from the monster in the closet. And they wake up the next morning and conclude that must have saved them. Now, that is not logical. And we expect that from children. But when adults behave that way, it's a problem. And so I would say to my atheistic friend, he says, well, I know the scientific method. I don't need to give a reason for it. I'm going to say, actually, if you're going to be rational, you do. Otherwise, you're acting like a child. You believe in the monster in the closet, and you have no basis for it. And so I would argue that secularists do not have a basis for logic, science, mathematics, any of that stuff. They cannot account for it in their own worldview, and therefore they're being like little children believing in something for which they have no basis on their own worldview.
Is there more helium in space than on Earth?
Yes, because there's more space. So, if you're talking about density, I don't know. The Earth tends to have a lot more of the heavier stuff, the heavier elements, oxygen and carbon, silicon, things like that.
So is the Earth losing helium because it continues to rise into space?
The helium, it's a little counterintuitive. Helium has gravity. We tend to think of helium as floating. It has levity, but that's because it displaces air, and air is heavier than helium. Oxygen and nitrogen are heavier than helium. But helium, once it gets out to the outer atmosphere, especially when you have a solar flare, and that'll heat up the Earth's atmosphere, and that'll kick out helium atoms. And so the Earth is slowly leaking helium. That's true.
And where do nebulae get their helium? And how do nebulae form?
I don't think nebula do form. I think they were created by God. I don't think there's any other explanation for that. And the original elements, hydrogen and helium, I think those are all created. They're created by God. Some people say, well, you've heard the old expression, we're all made of star stuff. Carl Sagan used to say that. We're all made of, stardust. Because in the secular view, the Big Bang can't produce heavier elements like oxygen and nitrogen, all the stuff that the Earth's made of. You can't make that in the Big Bang. The Big Bang's supposed to produce hydrogen and helium, but the Big Bang has its own set of problems. But the bottom line is we know that the Earth was created before the stars, so the Earth is not made of star stuff. I think so. The nebulae, I think, are created by God. Yeah.
What do you believe is the reason God created man?
Why did God create man? We know, I can give that an ultimate answer to that is for his own glory, because everything that God does is for his own glory. In terms of the specifics, I can't give a specific answer to that. God doesn't require us, I can tell you that. We are not needed. But nonetheless, God is a God of love, and so I think He made human beings to love. Now, there's three members of the Trinity, so God doesn't need people to love, because the three members of the Trinity love the other. Each member of the Trinity loves the other two members of the Trinity. So you have love without people, but nonetheless, it's out of His graciousness, out of His love, God created human beings, and of course freely offers salvation to us, even though we've rebelled against Him. That's awesome, awesome thought.
I would just add to that, one of the things that God does in creating man and allowing history to unfold as He has is to display His attributes not only to Himself, but also to His creation. So even without the creation of everything, God would not be able to display His attributes of long-suffering and grace and mercy and justice, because there would be no opportunity amongst the members of the Trinity for God to show His justice, His mercy, His grace, or His long-suffering. But with a sinful humanity, He can do that, and He can display those attributes to His creation for His glory and for the good of that creation. So that creation, He can lavish it with its goodness while displaying those attributes, glorify Himself, and be good to you and I.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
What was God doing before creation?
The interesting thing about that question is there is no before the creation, you understand, because it's in the beginning that God created, so there's no time before creation. Now,
God exists.
But God exists beyond creation. That might be a better way to put it. God created time. There is no before the beginning. It's like going further north than the North Pole. You get to the North Pole, that's it. You're done. But God is not limited to creation. And God is not temporal either. He doesn't exist within time. That's hard for us. That's hard for us to understand, because all our thinking is within time. We're temporal creatures. We live within. We need space and time to exist. God doesn't need space or time to exist. He made space and time. So there actually is no before the beginning. We might talk about it metaphorically. Before the beginning, God was. There really isn't a before the beginning, even though God is beyond space and time.
Is the Aristotelian proof of the existence of God consistent with a biblical worldview if it attempts to prove God without the Bible? Is that an example of general revelation?
In a sense, yes. Aristotle argued that God is the prime mover. It's interesting. His argument's interesting. I don't think it's the best argument, because the best argument is that we know God exists is we have revelation from God. Right? Of course, we have ultimately His Word. But even Aristotle's arguments, Aristotle's assuming things like laws of logic. Aristotle is considered the pioneer of laws of logic, really. But he discovered them and was able to do so because of the mind of God, you see. So even his argument tacitly presupposes the Christian worldview, even though he didn't identify as a Christian.
What are your thoughts on Planet 9? And I'm assuming they're not asking about Pluto.
Yeah. There's currently no evidence of any planets beyond Neptune. That doesn't mean it's impossible that there could be. If they exist, they're really far out there and very dark, because the technology now exists that if there were a planet, say, 2 or 3 times the distance of Neptune, that's as big as the Earth, we would have found it. We would have already seen it. So that means they're either not there, or they're really far away, or they're nearly pitch black where they don't reflect much sunlight back. So it is possible that there's another planet out there.
Does there come a point at which the distance that a planet would be away from our sun would be too far for it to actually be within our sun's gravitational pull of any size?
Yeah. Once you get out to a substantial fraction of the distance to the next star, then it's not that gravity never goes to zero. It just diminishes, but it diminishes to the point where the next star out would have a significant effect on that planet and would tend to eject it from our solar system. So once you get out to maybe beyond 10,000 astronomical units, one astronomical unit is the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So you get 10,000 times that distance, then the effects of the gravity of the other stars starts to kick in, and you can't really have stable orbits too much beyond that.
Do you agree with Kepler's idea that science is thinking God's thoughts after him?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the whole point of science, is to think God's thoughts after him and to glorify him for what he's made in the consistent way that he upholds creation.
And what advice do you have for homeschool parents raising their children or choosing their kids' science curriculum?
Well, I got some great resources back there. You might check out my friends over at Answers in Genesis as well. They have some wonderful curricula there. Just make sure you get them solid in the Word of God. And education, it's interesting because I went through the public school system. I'm not proud of that, but it's just true. And, some people say, well, you went to public school and you turned out okay. First of all, I'm not okay. Okay, I'm not.
You don't believe that Pluto was a planet, so there you go.
So there you go. Yeah. And secondly, God can redeem us. He can use the miseducation that I had. And don't get me wrong. I appreciate. Maybe some of you are teachers in the public education. I appreciate that there are Christians in public education that are displacing someone who would undoubtedly teach a very secular worldview. So I'm not knocking that, but nonetheless, I'm a strong advocate of homeschooling. I think it's wonderful because it really is really biblical, and you can delegate, I believe, but nonetheless, God never gave the government the right over children's education, never. And it's kind of interesting, Jesus, when they show him they asked him about taxes, and he says, "Show me a coin whose face is on this coin, whose image is on this coin. Caesar, give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Whose image are children made in? God's image. Don't give unto Caesar that which belongs to God." That being the case, I'm a strong advocate of homeschooling if you can do it. It's really a wonderful thing to do, and there's some wonderful resources now available. The resources back there. And I now believe that the point of education is to learn to think in a way that's consistent with the mind of God. That's the point of education, to take captive every thought into obedience to Christ. That's a biblical theme. And so if I'm going to teach children, I'm going to teach them history from the perspective, not just that here's a bunch of dead guys and what happened to them. No, here's the sovereign unfolding of God's plan throughout time. That's a different perspective, isn't it? Mathematics, I'm not just going to teach them, here's what you need to know so you can build bridges. I'm going to say, no, here's a window into the mind of God. That's kind of what I showed in the previous session. And I find a lot of people, if they're taught it that way, wow, math isn't so boring after all. I'm thinking God's thoughts after him. That's kind of different, isn't it?
What advice then do you have for parents whose kids are in public school or private school that is not a young earth creationist environment?
Pull them out. I do think it's okay to delegate a little bit, but you have to be very careful about that. You're responsible for the education of your children. Yes, you can delegate. You can say, Uncle Fred is really good at math. I'd like him to teach you math. Okay, that's fine, but you're still responsible ultimately for them. And so homeschooling's great. It's if you can send them to a private school, especially a Christian school, it's going to teach biblical creation. They're rare, but there are a few of them. That's a great option as well.
In Scripture, God has prescribed the eating of animal flesh, and our bodies seem to be biologically adapted to the proteins and fats of healthful. Are biologically adapted to eating proteins and fats and being able to process them, I guess. Yes, Adam and Eve were vegetarians prior to the fall when there was no death. Therefore, is it true that consuming meat is short of God's original design?
Well, it is in the sense, originally human beings were designed to eat plants, and animals. All animals were originally vegetarian, according to Genesis 1:29 and 30. So, and a lot of people think, well, that's silly. You telling me lions used to eat plants? Yes, lions used to eat plants. And by the way, sometimes even today they'll go back to their pre-fall diet. There was a case of Little Tyke. She was a 350-pound female lion raised in captivity who refused to eat meat her entire life. I've got pictures of her. They tried to give her meat. She turned away from it. She didn't even like the smell of meat. She liked milk, but not meat. And she did like eggs, but not meat. And so animals don't really need meat. They don't. Even animals that we think of as carnivores. Human beings, we don't really need meat. Now, it is true that today in our fallen world, it's a post-flood world. It was after the time of the flood, God gave Noah permission to eat meat. And there's any number of reasons why that could be. It could be that, there are some plants that are now extinct. And it could be that some of those plants had some of the proteins that we're missing now. I don't know. But the fact is, God did give us permission to eat meat. So in Genesis, I think it's Genesis 9:3. So, every living thing that moves, I'm giving you to eat. So that's why you can eat a hot dog, because that's pretty much every living thing that moves. So you're okay with that. But it is short of the original plan, but it's probably a good idea to eat meat unless you're really conscious about make sure you get the right nutrients from plants.
Is there going to be a follow-up to the basics of presuppositional apologetics in future presentations of your book form, or any presuppositional works that are coming down the line?
Yes, and in fact, they're already done. A couple of them are already done. The 2 DVDs called Nuclear Strength Apologetics. There's 2 of them. Those are follow-ups to the Ultimate Proof of Creation that I did last night. And they go into other areas and just kind of explore that concept a little bit more, and practical application too. In at least one of those DVDs, I go through and I show conversations that I've had with people. Some of them via email, where I've dialogued with folks. Also on our website, the Biblical Science Institute, one of the more popular sections on that website is called Refuting the Critics. And I'll go through and I'll show you how to do presuppositional apologetics. Because in every response I give is a presuppositional response. Now, sometimes I'll bring in evidence, but I do it in a presuppositional way, a way that assumes biblical authority, presupposes biblical authority, and does an internal critique of the secular worldview. So the website, those DVDs, and I'm sure we'll have more in the future. Yeah.
Is the difference between a wild animal and a domestic a loss of information? Wolves are wild, have more information. Black Labradors are domestic and have less information.
That is generally true. Domesticated animals tend to have less of the heterozygous state, where you have big A, little a, big B, little b. Domestic animals tend to have more of the homozygous, big A, little b, and so on. And that does cause problems, because it turns out that a lot of diseases, if they're caused by a mutation, a lot of times, if you'll have a mutated gene and a healthy gene, you won't suffer a disease. You'll be healthy. The good gene will sort of cover up the bad gene. In other words, mutations tend to be recessive. But on the other hand, if you have domestic animals where you've inbred them, that concentrates those mutations, you see, and so you're more likely to get a mutated gene on the same locus, the same site. Or locus. Anyway, and then you're more likely to suffer from a disease. So that's why domestic animals tend to be not as healthy as wild ones.
If evolution is just a rescue device or cover for immorality, isn't attacking evolution missing the foundation? Isn't the foundational problem really just a rebellion, and evolution is an excuse? So should we as believers then focus on rebellion primarily and evolution secondarily?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. It's certainly the case that people use evolution as an intellectual cover for their sin, for the fact that they have a rebellious heart. But here's the problem: you can't change a person's heart. You can't. That's up to God. Only God can change a person's heart. And so, my goal as an apologist is to do what God tells me to do, to give a defense of the faith. And so I'm going to deal primarily with the intellectual blocks that they raise, knowing that it is, in fact, a hard issue. There's no doubt about that. And I would not be hesitant to point it out to them. So, the reason you believe in evolution ultimately is because you're a wicked sinner. Really. And I said, and lest you think I'm talking down to you, that's exactly what I would be, except the Lord changed my heart. So I'm not superior to you in any way. I was a wicked sinner before God turned my heart around. I'd be in the same boat you're in. So, and because I care about you, I want to share with you, some of these things. So it is a hard issue, and you do need to keep that in mind. But you also need to keep in mind, you can't change a person's heart. All we can do is help them over the intellectual stumbling blocks. We want to urge them, obviously, to repent, knowing that ultimately repentance is a gift from God.
Are we now discovering, or are we not discovering, that even the physical may be infinite? Quarks and the smaller particles with silly names. Sorry, I cannot remember the names of them, but I believe there are 4.
Okay. I don't think so. We think that quarks are fundamental, meaning they're not made up of anything smaller. We think electrons are fundamental. They're not made up of anything smaller. Could they be? Yes. But there are some reasons to think they probably aren't. Because once you get down to the quantum level, nature gets really weird, really, really fast. You think relativity is weird. Talk about quantum mechanics. Oh, it's bizarre. Things that don't act like discrete particles anymore. They start acting like waves. And a wave doesn't have one position in the space, right? A wave's kind of everywhere, isn't it? And particles start behaving like that, where they start acting like they're kind of here and there. And it's not a violation of laws of logic, because a wave can be here and there, because a wave is extended in space. And so particles start behaving like that. And so if they were made up of smaller particles, then they wouldn't have that wave nature.
This will be a quick one. How do you challenge or refute the worldview of secular evolution growing within the church today? The idea that God used evolution and mankind, Adam and Eve, were just the first to be made in God's image.
Yeah, the first presentation I gave today really hit that topic pretty hard. The fact is that all Christian theology is based on creation, directly or indirectly. The fact that God made Adam and Eve, were made in the image of God, and therefore responsible to God for our actions. Adam sinned. That's why we're born into the world sinners. Sinners beget sinners. So we have that sin nature. The fact that death is the penalty for sin, that's a Genesis theme. If Adam and Eve is just a fairy tale, you have no rational basis for believing that death is the penalty for sin. And if that's not the case, why did Jesus die on the cross? And so it's very clear that, and also too, I think it impugns the nature of God to say that God is a cruel ogre who created over billions of years of death and suffering, that he intended it to be that way and said it's very good. No, it's not very good. And things die and things suffer, not because of God's fault, but because it's the right punishment for sin. It's our fault, not God's fault. And really, the person who blames God for death and suffering is doing just exactly what Adam did. When Adam sinned, he blamed God indirectly. He blamed the woman. But he said, the woman who you gave to me. Why did he say that? Was it to distinguish Eve from all the other women that were on the planet? No, he's impugning God. He's saying, you gave her to me. and that is inappropriate. Adam had nobody to blame but Adam. And likewise, when we say, God's responsible for death and suffering, and that's what you believe. If you believe in evolution, if you believe God guided it, then you believe God is responsible for death and suffering. But no, we are responsible for death and suffering.
And what is the most difficult single evidence for old Earth that you still struggle with?
Oh, I don't think there are any. I mean, I would be honest with you if I thought there were some. I think starlight was the last issue for me, but now that I've studied that more, I think, well, that's a non-starter right there. The idea that starlight proves an old universe. It doesn't. If you know anything about relativity, Einstein physics and synchrony conventions. And I know that's complicated if you haven't heard that stuff before, but I've studied it for a long time. And so for me, it's very, very clear. Radiometric dating, and before the RATE project, that was kind of a holdout. But now we got really good answers to that, to the point that it kind of flips it around. It's like, how do you explain radiometric dating if you believe in millions of years? Because the fact is, I didn't cover this in the presentation, but radioactive decay produces helium as a byproduct. And we find helium in these rocks that we find. And yet, if it had happened over millions of years, as the evolutionists believe, the helium should have leaked out. Because rocks are porous. They have little holes in them, and they can leak gas. And we've measured the rate at which they leak gas, and it's rapid. And so the fact is, if this radioactivity really had happened over billions of years, why do these rocks have so much helium in them? And the RATE research team studied that issue and found that the data are consistent with about 6,000 years, very consistent. And so you turn that around on them. You say, what used to be your main argument really belongs to us now. The fact is, you can't account for these things. I don't think there is. I have yet to hear a good argument for an old Earth. All of them assume arbitrarily either naturalism, the idea that there's no God, God didn't create, or uniformitarianism, which is the idea that rates and conditions have been basically constant and therefore denies a worldwide flood. And those are anti-biblical assumptions, aren't they? And so anyone who makes an argument for an old Earth has already rejected the biblical timeline in order to make the argument, in which case they are begging the question. Yes, very good.
So if you assume what you're trying to prove,
yes,
which evolutionists have to do in order to argue for an old Earth, they have to make certain assumptions. They're begging the question.
Every argument that I've heard for an old Earth begs the question. Every single one. I have yet to find an exception. And by the way, lest people think, well, you're doing that too. No, I'm not. Because you'll notice the arguments that I made were an internal critique, where I assumed the starting point of my opponent to show that it leads to a contradiction. I assumed, for the sake of argument, that uniformitarianism is true, and that the moon really has been moving at this general rate. The tidal breaking constant's always been the same. That's a uniformitarian assumption, you see, and it leads to an inconsistency. Anyway, you still get a young universe, you see. And so the arguments that we make do not beg the question. Rather, they're an example of the don't answer strategy.
What's the difference between world and planet?
World's more generic. You can even use world to talk about like the world of men. World's just a region. The moon is a world. I like to use it as just kind of a generic term for anything, really. World. Planet has a specific definition, especially now that the International Astronomical Union, that back in 2005, they came up with the definition. It's not a perfect definition, but it's sufficient. A planet has to be round in shape, basically round, and it has to have cleared out all the other objects that are orbiting at that distance. So if you have other similar sized objects at that distance, then it's not considered a planet.
Okay, so we have two different last and final categories of questions.
Okay.
One is not something you've touched on here, but I'll throw it out there and let you take a swing at it. How do you defend the infallibility of the Bible as it has been translated and interpreted differently over time in and out of context, especially with reference to Genesis?
Well, it's interesting. People who ask that question often haven't really studied that issue, because when you take a look at, people say, well, the Bible's a translation of a translation of a translation. Well, I'm sorry, but you don't know what you're talking about. The Bible's been translated once. I mean, in terms of most of the major translations today have been translated directly from Hebrew into English and directly from the New Testament directly from Greek into English. Been translated once. Now, the copying issue is different because the Bible has been copied many times, but we find ancient copies of the Bible, and so we can see often where little changes have come in. And yes, little changes have come in over time. That's kind of, I think, disappointing to some Christians when they first learn that, because they have this impression that, the Bible came down in its current form in the NIV on Mount Sinai, and it's exactly the way that it used to be. It's not. It's changed a little bit, but the fact that we can see these older copies, we can see where it's changed, and we can often reconstruct the original, and so we know what the original text was. And when you do compare these ancient manuscripts, you find that the Bible really is the most authentic book of the ancient world. There are a couple of ways you could measure the authenticity of a book in terms of its faithfulness to the original copy. One of them would be the number of ancient manuscripts that you find. More is better, obviously, because then you can compare and you can see where there are a little difference. If this verse is the same in all of them, you can say, well, that's pretty much it, isn't it? If there are little changes, you can say, oh yeah, but this word doesn't make sense in this. What that one does, that's obviously the original. You can often figure it out. So the number of ancient manuscripts, and then the shortness of the time between when the document was originally written and the oldest one that we find, shorter being better, right? Because at shorter time, there's been less time for there to be any changes made. And when you use those two criteria, you find that the most authentic book of the ancient world is the Bible, by far. The New Testament, followed by the Old Testament, and then like in a distant third is like the Iliad or something like that by Homer. And so when you do your homework, the Bible has been very faithfully transmitted. And I won't say that it's perfect, but it's been faithfully transmitted to the point that if you look at the changes on these different things, it amounts to like one word per page on a typical Bible. That's how much it's changed. Not much. And most of those are very minor, the instead of a or something like that. There's been no changes in any of the major doctrines. So the Bible really if you do your homework, the Bible really has been very faithfully preserved for us by the Lord.
When you talk about changes in the transmission of the text, you're really not talking about changes so much as you're talking about copyist errors.
Yes, copyist errors.
And that's different. It's not like somebody read a verse and then said, well, I'm going to change this. I'm going to throw reincarnation out of the text and change it to be something else, or I'm going to insert resurrection into the text and change it from something else. We're talking about sometimes word order, sometimes the absence or presence of an indefinite or definite article, sometimes talking about misspellings of words, the elimination of a word, or sometimes the contraction of words, like can't from cannot, things like that are copyist errors that do not affect the meaning of the text. They affect the appearance of the text.
Yeah.
That's the type of changes that we're making, but they're copyist errors, which we can identify when you compare copies to copies. So I'll give you, since we have a few minutes, I'll give you a quick illustration of this. Imagine that I were to put 4 or 5 sentences up on that screen, and then I were to give you a few minutes to copy word for word everybody in this room, 4 or 5 paragraphs up on the screen. And everybody made a copy, and then I eliminated that, took it off of the screen. If we went out here and compared copy with copy with copy, you would find some spelling errors. You would find some punctuation errors. You'd find the absence of a certain article, a or an or the. But if we took all the copies that were represented in this room, we compared them with one another, do you think we could accurately recreate the original that was on the screen? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, we could, because we can identify what the copyist errors are in Scripture. So that's what we're talking about. Fair enough?
Yeah.
Okay, so the last question that we have was probably asked by half a dozen different people, and it had to do with climate change, global warming.
Yeah.
So let me give you kind of the range of the kinds of questions that were asked, and then you can answer this or we can kick this around as our final topic. Because I don't believe that you addressed this at all in any of the
didn't.
presentations.
No.
Okay. Here's a sampling of the questions. Would the movement of the moon away from the Earth and the decay of the magnetic force explain what used to be called global warming? Wait, hold on. Let me give you some more. Is the climate of today unprecedented, or has it happened before? What is the evidence of man's causation of climate change? And is the data consistent and definite, or variable and subject to interpretation depending on one's agenda? Let's grab some of those, and then we'll move on to other related questions.
Okay, I don't think the moon or the magnetic field affect the weather too much. The moon shouldn't affect it hardly at all, because it's only since creation the moon's only moved 730 feet away from the Earth, so it's not a huge difference. The magnetic field might have a very small effect in that the magnetic field prevents cosmic rays from intersecting the Earth's atmosphere. And some people have theorized that cosmic rays can form seeds for clouds, so there could be a very slight effect on weather, but I wouldn't think it would be very substantial. So I don't think that would affect it very much. Is our current period of climate change unprecedented? No, the climate changes from time to time. That happens. There was a period around 1000 AD where we had what we call the medieval warming period, where there's evidence that the Earth's temperature was just a little higher during that time, higher than it is today, actually. There was a period during I think it's the 1700s, where we had what they call the Little Ice Age in Europe, where the Earth's temperatures went down for a little while, for a few decades, and came back up. Climate change is natural. It tends to be cyclic, because it not necessarily a simple cycle, but we don't know exactly why these things happen, why it goes down and up. A lot of it could be connected to the sun. The sun has natural cycles, some of which we understand, some of which we don't understand. But the sun does not always produce exactly the same luminosity. It's a little bit hotter at times and a little bit cooler at times. When the sun has more sunspots, when it's active, you might think it'd be cooler because the sunspots are darker, but the rest of the sun overcompensates. And so the sun is slightly warmer when sunspots are high, and Earth's temperatures tend to be a little warmer when there's more sunspots on the sun. And that's a 22-year cycle. But then there are other longer cycles that could affect it as well. What was the other one, that last one? I forget.
The moon. Oh, the agenda.
Say that again.
Is the data consistent and definitive, or variable and subject to interpretation to fit a preconceived agenda?
Yeah, I mean, there's some data that's clear. I think there's good evidence that the Earth's temperature is a little bit warmer now than it was 100 years ago. It's gone up by like 1.5 degrees. There's some evidence for that. So that's good data. The rest really is speculation, though, in terms of, well, it's gonna run away and become, you're gonna have runaway global warming. And they used to say that, but there's been no evidence of global warming for the last 20 years. So now they call it climate change. That way, no matter what happens, they can say we were right. But there's been no evidence of that at all for the last 20 years. So it's just a natural cycle that there's no evidence that it'll run away catastrophically. By the way, we have a promise from God that catastrophic global warming will not happen at least until Judgment Day, and there's no preventing that one. But Genesis 8:22, God promises that the basic cycles of nature, the seasons, seed time and harvest, will continue in the future as they have in the past. Day and night cycle will continue in the future as in the past, as long as the earth remains. And so we have a promise from God that catastrophic global warming that would end life, that would end the seasons, can't happen. It's not possible. Not possible.
Do you remember back in the 1980s, we were all warned about global cooling and the coming ice age? You guys all remember that? I do.
Yeah.
Are there assumptions built into the global warming models, global warming hysteria? Are there certain things that they have to assume in order to make that hysteria seem reasonable?
Yes, one of which is the Milankovitch theory, it's just I don't want to go into too much detail. It's a ridiculous model that's based on evolution. It's based on millions of years. The idea that the Earth's it has to do with the orbital resonance that the Earth has with the sun, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but you don't have to know that to know. Yes, it's very model dependent. That the Milankovitch theory is internally inconsistent because it requires two different data points that are contradictory to both be right in order for it to work. A colleague of mine, Jake Hebert, pointed that out, wrote some papers on it. It's a devastating refutation of the Milankovitch, and most of the global warming hype is based on the Milankovitch. as well as a lot of the different dating techniques. You've heard about ice cores and things like that, allegedly proving the millions of years. They all calibrate those to the Milankovitch, though, which has now been refuted. So there's a lot of hype there, but we have a promise from God. There's not going to have catastrophic global warming. There's no scientific evidence for catastrophic global warming or global cooling. There is evidence that you have these mild and natural variations in climate. That's what we'd expect as part of the cycle that God built into nature. But God's built a very robust earth, and you can't break it as easily as people think they can.
We got through all the questions in a timely manner. Give Jason a round of applause and your thanks for doing this. All right, just a couple of announcements here before I will close in prayer. Number one, we do have leftover food supplies that are back here on this table. We would love to sell those to you for what we paid for them. So if you want to go back and pick up some chips or some tomatoes or onions or dressing or salsa or any of that stuff, and you want to take home some of that meat, go back there and chat with the ladies and dicker with them for whatever seems reasonable. That's available. Number two, this is, for those of you who may not know, this is conferences like this are something that we as a church are hoping to do twice a year, once in May and once in October. This next October, we have coming here Scott Klusendorf, who runs the Pro-Life Training Institute. Scott is the premier pro-life apologist in the world today. He's a fantastic presenter. You will be blessed immensely by what he is going to present. Scott deals with not just the pro-life issue, answering the arguments for abortion, but also communicating the gospel in dealing with the abortion issue to those who have had an abortion or are affected by abortion or are considering abortion. And then Scott deals also with edge of life issues. So he's going to address what are the morals and ethics of beginning of life issues, cloning, stem cell research, in vitro fertilization, how should Christians view these things, when does life begin, etc. And then he deals with the end of life issues, euthanasia, and when is it okay to pull the plug, when is pulling the plug the same thing as euthanasia, when do we intervene to save somebody's life, and when is it appropriate to let them die, living trusts and wills and all of that stuff. Those are ethical issues that as Christians we have to work through, because if you haven't already, you will someday have to make decisions regarding end of life issues for a loved one. And having the moral framework and the Christian worldview in place for you to be able to work ethically through those issues is very helpful, and that is what Scott's expertise is. So that will be October, I think it's 17th and 18th of this year. We'll have registration open on our website in July, and since you are registered for this conference, you'll get an email announcing when that registration will be is open, and you'll have a chance to go to the website and register, and there'll be an early bird price and all of that. We're going to basically have kind of the same format we have here, a Friday night and an all-day Saturday. That's going to continue into the foreseeable future. And then we'll change a few of the smaller details, like what we have for lunch and things. Speaking of that, would you please give a round of applause to all of the ladies who took care of the kids and did our meals. And I want to recognize many of them stayed in the kitchen and were in and out for various parts of the sessions, as well as the sound and video guys who helped make this work, as well as the security men who are sitting amongst you, keeping us safe and sometimes have to miss sessions. There was a lot that went into this, and we're very grateful for all that you did, many of you behind the scenes. I think that is it. There seems to be one more announcement that I was going to make. For those of you who are part of Kootenai Community Church, Andrew Rappaport will be doing in Sunday school tomorrow morning the book of Leviticus in 1 hour. And then he is going to do, that's a different pace than what you're used to in Sunday morning worship service, right? And then he's going to be preaching on the book of James and faith, the relationship between faith and works during the message. And then after the session, after Sunday worship service, he's going to be meeting in the room over here with those of you interested in doing street evangelism and passing out tracts to equip you and kind of get you started in that ministry in some way. So that is happening tomorrow. Next May, this is what I was going to mention. We have Scott Klusendorf coming in October. Next May, a year from now, not on Lost in the 50s weekend. That was a mistake because I don't care about cars, so it wasn't even on my radar to schedule around that, and I apologize for that. So it won't be Lost in the 50s weekend. But next May, the end of May, we have Paul Taylor coming from the Mount St. Helens Creation Center. Jason knows Paul, has worked with Paul, met Paul. And next year in May is the 40th anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and he is going to be coming and doing creation apologetics from the perspective of one who knows the Mount St. Helens event. And it will be basically a little more than a week after the 40th anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So that's what we have on the docket for the next year. Thank you again to Jason. Give him a round of applause, everyone. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.